Ethan Carrington smirked as the woman in military uniform walked past him, his voice slicing the air with a careless sneer. Priority boardings for paying customers. What he didn't know was that by sunrise, her name, and the truth about who she really was, would be splashed across every headline, leaving his arrogance exposed for the world to see. Some mistakes you can apologize for, others you spend a lifetime regretting. George Bush Intercontinental Airport buzzed like a disturbed beehive, its terminals packed with restless travelers weaving between rolling suitcases and loudspeaker announcements. At Gate D7, the late evening flight to Atlanta was delayed by some minor technical issue, leaving a growing cluster of passengers shifting impatiently on tired feet, clutching coffees and crumpled boarding passes. The smell of fast food and stale air conditioning clung to the walls like an invisible fog. Ethan Carrington stood in the priority boarding line, one polished loafer tapping a sharp, impatient rhythm against the tile floor. His tailored navy suit still looked crisp after a long day, the shine on his Italian leather shoes catching the harsh overhead lights. Every few seconds, he checked the Rolex on his wrist, sighing louder each time, not caring who heard. His phone buzzed with another client email, another dinner to confirm, another project deadline to squeeze in. Ethan barely glanced at it. All that mattered now was getting to Atlanta, getting to his meetings, and getting the deal closed. Nothing else. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, half apologetic, half resigned. "We appreciate your patience, folks. We'll begin boarding in just a few minutes." Ethan muttered under his breath, "Some of us have real places to be," earning a few glances from the economy passengers nearby. He didn't care. He adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase over his shoulder, already mentally crafting the email he'd send blasting the airline for their incompetence. That's when he saw her. A woman, moving steadily toward the front of the line, duffel slung over one shoulder, military uniform neat but travel-worn. Staff Sergeant Naomi Pierce. She wasn't flashy about it, no fanfare, no announcement, but the uniform spoke volumes. A few passengers instinctively stepped aside as she passed, offering small nods of respect without a word. Her posture was perfect, boots scuffed but clean, her face composed despite the exhaustion lingering in her eyes. Ethan, watching her approach, rolled his eyes in exaggerated exasperation. Without thinking, because men like him rarely thought when annoyance got the better of them, he leaned slightly toward the businessman next to him and muttered, just loud enough, "Priority boardings for paying customers." The words hung in the heavy airport air like smoke from a burned-out match. The man beside him stiffened but said nothing, pretending to fiddle with his phone. A woman clutching a tote bag tightened her grip, her mouth thinning into a disapproving line. Someone coughed awkwardly. But no one spoke up. No one challenged it. Naomi heard it, of course she did. She paused for just a fraction of a second, enough for the comment to sink in, her jaw tightening so slightly it was almost invisible. She didn't turn around. She didn't lash out or even glance at him. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her duffel and moved forward with the quiet grace of someone who had survived far worse than petty insults from entitled strangers. Her boarding pass beeped softly at the scanner, and she disappeared down the jet bridge without a word. Ethan smirked to himself, pleased at his own cleverness, certain someone around him was secretly nodding in agreement. But when he glanced up, the man next to him was studying the flight screen a little too intently, and the woman with the tote bag had turned away, her posture rigid. The line shuffled forward under a strained silence. Ethan barely noticed. His mind was already on the hotel bar waiting for him in Atlanta, on the expensive scotch he planned to order once he checked in. The gate agent called for priority boarding again, and Ethan swaggered forward, flashing his boarding pass without so much as a glance at the agent. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed under soft lighting. Ethan slid into his window seat, stretching out with a grunt of satisfaction, loosening his tie and sighing dramatically as he stowed his briefcase. A few rows ahead in economy, Naomi was tucking her duffel carefully into the overhead bin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime packing in a hurry. She settled into her middle seat without complaint, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead. She didn't pull out a book. She didn't scroll through her phone. She simply sat, still and composed, while the cabin buzzed softly around her. Ethan glanced forward again briefly, catching sight of the top of her uniform collar before losing interest. To him, she was just another tired traveler, just another inconvenience in his path, easily forgotten. The safety demonstration droned on. The engines rumbled to life. As the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, Ethan leaned back in his seat, letting the soft vibration of the plane lull him into a light, restless sleep. Somewhere in the haze of fatigue and arrogance, he comforted himself with the thought that the world still ran on deals and titles and status. People like him, the polished, the important, still ruled it. People like her? Uniform or no uniform, they were background noise. But not everyone forgot. A few rows behind Naomi, an elderly man with silver hair kept glancing up from his crossword puzzle, his pen tapping lightly against the tray table. Across the aisle, a young man in a worn Atlanta Braves hoodie stole uneasy glances at her uniform, his face troubled. Even the flight attendants, moving briskly through the aisles with practiced smiles, seemed quieter than usual, their cheerful tones dampened by an invisible tension. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even obvious. But the energy around Naomi was different, heavier, weighted with something no one could quite name. Naomi sat through it all in silence. Her hands, strong and steady from years of field training, rested lightly on her knees. Her mind wandered, not to anger, not to bitterness, but to memory. To the countless flights she had taken home from deployments, sitting in cramped middle seats, wearing this same uniform, carrying the invisible weight of lives saved and lives lost. She remembered the nights she sat by the bedsides of the wounded, holding hands that would never grasp back. She remembered letters she had written to families, words she knew would never be enough. And now, she remembered the casual cruelty of a stranger at Gate D7, another stone thrown by someone who would never know the cost. A few minutes into the flight, the elderly man from earlier stood up slowly, stretching as if to head toward the lavatory. As he passed Naomi's seat, he hesitated, then, with a quick furtive glance around, he slipped a small piece of folded paper onto her tray table without a word. Naomi blinked, caught off guard. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the paper flat against her palm. In shaky, hurried handwriting, it read simply, "Thank you for your service." Naomi swallowed against the sudden tightness in her chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't performative. It was recognition. Silent. Simple. Real. She folded the note carefully, slipping it into the breast pocket of her uniform. She didn't look around for who had left it. She didn't need to. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the quiet gratitude, letting it push back against the sting of earlier. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Ethan popped open a can of club soda and scrolled lazily through emails on his tablet. His smirk lingered. To him, the delay, the boarding line, the entire evening was just another inconvenience to swap war stories about over drinks with colleagues later. He didn't notice the tension that clung to the cabin like a thin layer of humidity. He didn't see the way passengers averted their eyes from him. He didn't feel the invisible wall that had sprung up between himself and the world around him the moment his words had left his mouth. The plane soared higher into the dark Texas sky, a silver bullet slicing through the night, its human cargo carrying invisible battles in their hearts. Battles like Naomi's. Battles Ethan Carrington, and all his polished arrogance, didn't even realize existed. Not yet. But fate had a way of dragging the truth into the light, and by the time the wheels touched down in Atlanta, Ethan's carefully built world would be only hours away from cracking open. Morning broke over Atlanta in muted shades of gray, the sun struggling to push through thick clouds that hung heavy over the city. The streets buzzed with the early hum of delivery trucks, bleary-eyed commuters, and the slow churn of another weekday unfolding. Inside a small brick-walled cafe tucked between an antique bookstore and a dry cleaner, Ethan Carrington stirred a packet of sugar absent-mindedly into his black coffee, the spoon clinking sharply against the porcelain mug. He was running on 4 hours of fitful sleep, the stale aftertaste of airline pretzels still lingering in his mouth, but none of it mattered. His mind was already skipping ahead to the day's agenda: 3 client meetings, a business lunch, a networking event in the evening. He barely noticed the cozy murmur of conversation around him or the faint scratch of jazz music playing overhead. His eyes were glued to his phone, thumb scrolling through a litany of emails, calendar invites, and LinkedIn notifications. Deals to close. People to impress. Another day chasing the same markers of success he had spent his life worshiping. He took a distracted sip of coffee, wincing at the bitterness. His thumb hovered over the next email when a news notification slid across his screen, barely catching his attention. Another political scandal, maybe. Another celebrity meltdown. He almost dismissed it, but then a name snagged his eye, a hook catching deep in his gut. Local Army medic honored for extraordinary bravery overseas. Without thinking, he tapped the headline. The article loaded slowly, the cafe's Wi-Fi sluggish under the morning rush, but when the image finally appeared, Ethan's world narrowed to a single point of clarity. Staring back at him, in crisp military dress blues, was the woman from last night. Staff Sergeant Naomi Pierce. The woman he had sneered at, dismissed, reduced to nothing more than an obstacle between him and his seat on a plane. The blood drained from his face. The article was brutally simple in its recounting. During a surprise mortar attack on a forward operating base in Eastern Europe, Staff Sergeant Pierce had administered life-saving aid to 12 wounded soldiers while under active fire. She had personally carried 3 men to safety, dragging them across exposed ground without thought for her own life. Her commanding officer was quoted, "Without her, several of our soldiers wouldn't be here today." She didn't hesitate. She never does. That's who she is. Ethan blinked hard, the words swimming in and out of focus. Around him, the cafe bustled on, baristas calling out orders, customers chatting over breakfast sandwiches, but it all sounded distant, muffled, like he was underwater. He set the phone down slowly, his hands trembling slightly. The memory of last night slammed into him with brutal clarity, her steady walk past him at the gate, the weight of her duffel, the way she had simply absorbed his words without flinching. How small she had made herself to avoid drawing more attention, how he had laughed it off, proud of himself for speaking aloud what others might have only thought. A nauseating wave of shame rose in his chest. He had mocked her. A hero. He had treated someone who had risked her life for others like she was nothing more than a line jumper. He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to steady his breathing, but the weight inside him only grew heavier. This wasn't just a bad look. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was something deeper, uglier, a rot he hadn't even realized had taken hold in him. The cafe's warmth felt suffocating now, the cheerful chatter around him grating against the roar of his own thoughts. He grabbed his phone again with fumbling fingers, searching desperately for her name. Naomi Pierce. Dozens of articles flooded the screen, from local news outlets to national headlines. Photos of her receiving medals, standing at attention, smiling humbly as commanding officers sang her praises. There were no personal social media accounts, no LinkedIn profile, nothing that offered a way to reach her. Just the public record of her courage, standing in stark, brutal contrast to his cowardice. Ethan slumped back in his chair, the realization settling over him like a shroud. He had no way to find her. No way to apologize. No way to undo the casual cruelty he had inflicted with a single sentence. The idea that he might never have the chance to say he was sorry hollowed him out. He thought of the way she had sat there on the plane, staring out the window with a stillness that spoke volumes. She had carried so much more than just a duffel bag onto that flight. She had carried scars, memories, burdens he could never begin to comprehend. And he had added one more weight to her load without a second thought. Ethan pushed his coffee away, the bitterness now coating his mouth and his conscience alike. His appetite, his carefully constructed self-image, even the urgency of his meetings, they all crumbled into meaningless dust. He buried his face in his hands, uncaring of the few curious glances thrown his way by other patrons. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the sickening clarity that he had seen someone in uniform, someone who had given more than he could fathom, and chosen to see only what he wanted, an inconvenience. A nobody. A threat to his own entitled comfort. His mind raced, searching for something he could do to fix it, to make it right. Could he write a letter? Track down her unit? Send a donation somewhere in her name? Every idea sounded hollow, performative, selfish. As if anything he did now could erase the ugliness of that moment. The damage wasn't just in the words he had spoken. It was in the mindset that had made those words so easy to speak. In the invisible scaffolding of privilege and arrogance that had built itself up inside him over decades without his even realizing it. True decency wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about issuing apologies only when you were caught or exposed. It was about how you treated people when there was nothing in it for you. No audience. No headlines. No accolades. Ethan stared blankly out the cafe window at the gray streets of Atlanta, the city waking up around him, people rushing past with coffee cups and briefcases and backpacks slung over tired shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he didn't see a sea of faceless strangers. He saw individuals. He saw stories he didn't know. Battles he couldn't see. Dreams and disappointments and burdens carried in silent dignity. Just like Naomi Pierce had carried hers. And he had added to them without a second thought. The shame burned hotter now, no longer just a distant discomfort but a searing indictment. He had been blind. Willfully blind. And now, he had to decide whether to stay that way or to finally, painfully, open his eyes. Ethan picked up his phone again, but not to scroll. Not to distract himself. He opened a blank note and typed a few simple words, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately, like carving something permanent into stone. Listen more. Assume less. Respect always. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a start. A vow. A line drawn in the sand of who he had been and who he refused to be any longer. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the words, letting them sink into him, letting them rewrite the architecture of his heart one quiet syllable at a time. Then, without ceremony, he locked his phone, tossed a few bills on the table for the coffee he hadn't finished, and stepped out into the cool, damp morning. The air smelled like rain and exhaust and the possibility of redemption. The air outside the cafe was crisp and damp, brushing against Ethan Carrington's face as he stood motionless on the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks. The city moved around him in the steady rhythm of another weekday morning, cars honking in the distance, a man balancing 3 coffee cups hustling toward an office building, a woman in sneakers power walking with earbuds jammed into her ears, but for Ethan, everything felt strangely suspended, as if he were standing in the eye of a storm he hadn't even realized he had walked into. The words he had just typed into his phone, listen more. Assume less. Respect always, echoed in his mind, a quiet, stubborn drumbeat beneath the noise of Atlanta's waking heartbeat. He didn't know exactly where he was going, his first meeting wasn't for another hour, and even if it had been starting now, he wasn't sure he could have walked into it pretending to be the same man he had been yesterday. He turned aimlessly down Peachtree Street, the coolness of the pavement rising through the thin soles of his shoes, his steps mechanical at first, then gradually more deliberate. For years, Ethan had moved through cities like this one with tunnel vision, focused only on deals, titles, dinners, hotel lounges, and networking events where handshakes were currency and name brands told you everything you needed to know about someone. But this morning, for the first time, he really looked. He noticed the older man in a faded Braves cap hunched against a brick wall, a paper cup balanced between worn sneakers. He noticed the young woman sitting alone on a bus stop bench, shoulders slumped under the weight of a too big backpack and invisible worries. He noticed the construction worker in a neon vest pausing to rub his lower back, exhaustion carved deep into the lines of his face. Stories, Ethan thought. Everyone carrying stories he would never fully know. Naomi Pierce had carried hers past him at gate D7, and he was blind. Arrogant, small, had chosen not to see her. Chosen not to honor what she carried. Shame tightened in his chest again, but this time it wasn't paralyzing, it was clarifying. It was a force propelling him forward, demanding he do better, even if no one else would ever notice. A block ahead, a small white church stood between two modern glass buildings like a stubborn relic of another time. Its battered wooden sign, slightly crooked, read in bold black letters, "True character is revealed when N01 is watching." Ethan stopped in his tracks, the words hitting him harder than any news article, harder even than his own internal reckoning. True character wasn't about apology tours or grand displays of regret. It was about how you moved through the world when there was no spotlight, no audience to applaud your decency. It was about seeing people, not the surface, not the clothes, not the assumptions, but the human being standing in front of you. His meeting was scheduled at a corporate skyscraper just a few blocks over, and with every step he took toward it, he felt the weight of that realization settle deeper into his bones. Inside the gleaming lobby, Ethan exchanged polite nods with the receptionist, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. As he rode the elevator to the 27th floor, he stared at his own reflection in the mirrored walls, expensive suit, perfect tie knot, confident posture, and for the first time in a long time, he saw the hollow behind the polish. The meeting room was already filling up when he arrived. Men and women in pressed shirts and business dresses clustered around the conference table, coffee cups steaming, laptops open, small talk bouncing back and forth like harmless tennis volleys. Normally, Ethan would have scanned the room instinctively, noting who mattered, who could be useful, who could be ignored. Today, he forced himself to slow down. He noticed who looked tired, who looked nervous, who looked like they were carrying battles invisible to the polished surface of a name badge. When the meeting started, Ethan listened more than he spoke. When the junior assistant nervously stumbled through a financial report, Ethan didn't glance away or check his phone. He leaned forward, nodded, asked clarifying questions not to trip her up, but to give her space to find her footing. It was a small thing, invisible to most of the room, but to the assistant, it was everything. After the meeting, instead of rushing out the door, Ethan lingered. He shook hands with the interns. He asked the receptionist how her morning was going and actually listened to the answer. Not because it would earn him anything, but because it mattered. Because she mattered. During his lunch break, Ethan sat alone at a small table by the window of a sandwich shop, pulling out his phone not to scroll aimlessly, but to reopen the note he had started that morning. He added a few more words beneath his original vow: see people. Honor their stories. Never reduce them. He locked the screen again, feeling the faintest lift in his chest. Redemption wouldn't come with one good deed or one day of right actions. It would come with the slow, daily sanding away of arrogance, the conscious rebuilding of who he was when no one else was watching. It would come with treating the next Naomi he crossed paths with, whether wearing a uniform or street clothes, whether carrying medals or invisible scars, with the dignity she deserved. That afternoon, as he walked back toward his hotel through the crowded sidewalks of downtown Atlanta, the world no longer looked like a background to his ambitions. It looked like a tapestry woven of a million quiet, unseen struggles and victories. It looked like something sacred. He passed a mother wrangling two toddlers in a stroller, her face flushed with effort, and offered a steadying smile. He stepped aside without hesitation to let an elderly man with a walker move ahead of him on the narrow sidewalk. He nodded respectfully at a security guard standing by an office entrance, not as a perfunctory gesture, but as a real acknowledgement. None of it made headlines. None of it would erase the words he had spoken at Gate D7 or the look Naomi Pierce hadn't given him when she had chosen, with grace and strength, to keep walking. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. That evening, after his meetings had ended and the city was bathed in the gold and pink wash of a fading sunset, Ethan stood on the balcony of his hotel room, overlooking the sprawling streets below. Lights flickered on one by one, tiny beacons of life in a city full of unseen battles. He thought about Naomi again, not just as the woman in uniform he had insulted, not just as the headline hero, but as a living, breathing person carrying burdens and bravery he had been too blind to recognize. Somewhere out there, she was moving through her own day, carrying her quiet strength forward without fanfare, without needing the validation of men like him. And he had the responsibility now to move through his own days differently, to leave every encounter, every passing moment, a little better than he found it. He pulled out his phone one last time that night, rereading the vow he had written. Listen more. Assume less. Respect always. See people. Honor their stories. Never reduce them. Ethan Carrington closed his eyes for a moment against the warm night breeze and made a silent promise to Naomi, to every unseen fighter he had ever overlooked, and to the man he still had a chance to become. A better man, built not on titles or polished shoes or expensive watches, but on the small, stubborn choice to do right when no one was clapping. When the world wasn't watching. When it was just him and his own reflection staring back across the fading light. Sometimes, it's not the loud moments that define who we are, but the quiet ones, the split-second decisions we make when we think no one is watching. Ethan Carrington's story reminds us that respect, humility, and genuine decency aren't about grand gestures or polished appearances. They're built in the unseen, everyday choices to honor the dignity of every person we encounter, especially when we have nothing to gain. We live in a world that moves fast, where it's easy to judge based on the surface, to rush past the stories carried quietly by those around us. But true strength of character is revealed when we slow down enough to see people as they really are, not by their clothes, their titles, or their status, but by the courage, the struggles, and the dreams they carry inside. The next time you're tempted to make a snap judgment, remember Staff Sergeant Naomi Pierce. Remember that behind every tired face at the airport, every quiet commuter on the train, every stranger you pass on the street, there may be a lifetime of sacrifices and bravery you'll never fully understand. And you don't need to know someone's story to treat them with the respect they deserve. The lesson is simple but powerful: listen more. Assume less. Respect always. It's not enough to feel guilty after we fail. Real change begins when we choose, day after day, moment after moment, to do better, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. Because character isn't about who we are when the spotlight is on. It's about who we are when no one's clapping. At U.S. Instructive Stories, we believe that stories like these aren't just tales to listen to, they're invitations. Invitations to look inward. To reflect. To grow. And maybe, if enough of us accept that invitation, we can build a world where respect and kindness are not the exception, but the standard. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Thank you for listening with an open heart. If this story made you think, even for just a moment, about how we treat the people we don't know, then today has been worth it. If you believe that stories of growth, redemption, and quiet courage matter, we invite you to subscribe to U.S. Instructive Stories. Because sometimes, the biggest difference you can make in someone's life is simply treating them like they matter. And that's where real change begins. Until next time, stay kind, stay humble, and keep seeing the unseen.